Philosophy session. My name is Levey, and I'm in the philosophy department at the University of Calgary. I didn't actually organize this panel. Joe Campbell of Washington State University did, so I just get the easy and pleasurable part of introducing our distinguished speakers. Our first speaker is Joshua Cohen, who is the Martha Sutton Weeks Professor of Ethics in Society and also Professor of Political Science and Law and Philosophy at Stanford University. He's written extensively in the area of democratic theory and globalization. And just to connect him to the last panel, he also teaches courses using design thinking to develop solutions to poverty. So, Joshua.
Thanks. So I wanted to just take a moment first to thank Kara. Is Kara around here? Anyway, we can thank, people should thank her individually then. She really is a very easy job to get here and participate in this event, and I think all the participants are grateful for that. So I'm going to offer, in case you can't see the screen from where you're sitting, reflections on civility. I have the, I'm going to be working both Obama style with widescreen teleprompter and Sarah Palin style with my writing on my hand. And I want to make sure for the, I know we've had some equipment issues. We're close enough to the microphone for it to work and not so close that it'll go off. Okay, anyway, reflections on civility organized around three questions. Here are the three questions. First, what is civility? Secondly, what are some of the benefits of civility? And third, what are some of the costs of civility? There is, of course, a fourth question. Fourth question is, do the benefits of civility outweigh the costs? I leave that important question as a topic for our discussion, anticipating that there will be sufficient time and enthusiasm to have that discussion. First question then, what is civility? As Lisa McGurr said earlier today, that's a hot topic. It's also a big topic, and it's a hot and a big topic. You have to have some focus. That's what it says in the middle in red. You need some focus. So I'm going to provide focus using some ideas from my late friend and teacher, John Rawls, the great American political philosopher who wrote in the early 1990s this book, Political Liberalism. That book was addressed to a huge issue. This is what you learn in design thinking, is how to model a huge issue. That's what we call a type design. It addresses a huge issue. Here is the huge issue. This is a bad design, but I had to get all the text on one screen. The issue, which has been a theme throughout the day today, is how can we live together in a reasonably just democratic society, given our profound disagreements, disagreements of interest, disagreement on ideas about justice, and disagreements in our philosophical, moral, and religious convictions. Rawls offered, as one part of a much more complicated answer, that we need to respect a duty of civility. One of the problems of having produced this PowerPoint on a Mac and playing it on a degraded PC is that you're missing the exquisite font choices. Anyway, take my word for it. So Rawls says that as a part of an answer to this question, the big, huge question of political liberalism, is that there's a need to respect a duty of civility. The duty of civility, he says, is a moral duty, not a legal duty. You don't get punished for violating it. Moreover, it's not a duty in our personal lives. It's not a duty in our social life generally. It's not, as he's thinking about it, and I'm going to be channeling his thought on it today, it's not about how we talk to our friends or students or members of our church or union or company. It's not how I'm going to talk to Brian later on in this, Tom, yeah, but, but not Brian. It's not about politeness and etiquette. This is the text of the rules of civility and decent behavior that were copied by George Washington when he was 16 years old. As it turns out, again referring to Lisa McGurr's talk earlier today, George Washington was the Miss Manners of the late 18th century. So these were some of the rules of civility. Lift not one eyebrow higher than another. Wry not the mouth, and bedew no man's face with your spittle by approaching too near him when you speak. This is a particularly important rule. Be not tedious in discourse, make not many digressions, nor repeat often the same manner of discourse. Some people think philosophers are particularly guilty of this, and we are here to prove you wrong on that. The duty of civility instead is about politics, and it is in particular about how we ought to argue with others on basic political and constitutional questions. In particular, the duty of civility requires two things. First, that we are prepared to explain to others why the laws that we support can be supported by values and principles that those other people can endorse, by public values and principles that lie on common ground, a term that has been alluded to through much of the day, not only alluded to, but actually used. Second, that we listen to others and be open to accommodating their views. Here are some examples. These are all examples of when you violate the duty of civility. So you violate the duty of civility when all you can say, this is all you can say in the context of support for a law or policy, when all you can say is, for example, there should be Sunday closing laws because that's when God fixed the Sabbath. There is that stuff about contraception in the Wisconsin bill. I don't think there is a Sunday closing law provision, but I haven't looked at the legislation that closely yet. Or if you say no abortion after 18 weeks, why? Because God ensouls the fetus at quickening. That violates the duty of civility. No gay marriage because in the Creator's plan, sexual complementarity and fruitfulness belong to the very nature of marriage. This comes from the Vatican statement on marriage written by then Cardinal Ratzinger. Or no morals laws because the basis of right and wrong, after all, is the autonomy of personal judgment. Or equal political rights because the life of political activity is the best human life. Those are, or civil disobedience is okay because unjust laws, in scare quotes, violate God's law and thus are not really laws after all. So if you accept the duty of civility, then you don't base your political arguments in that way, even if you think those are perfectly sound arguments. So the duty of civility, as I'm describing it, here again channeling the Rawlsian conception, the duty of civility demands self-restraint. Now here's a question suggested by some of the conversation this morning. Question is, did Martin Luther King Jr. violate the duty of civility when he wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail, and that is a picture of him, a bracing picture of him sitting in the Birmingham jail, when he wrote, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law." To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was the one who thought that you shouldn't have abortions after 18 weeks because God ensouls the fetus at quickening, to put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. No, when King wrote that in the letter from Birmingham jail, he didn't violate the duty of civility, and he didn't violate it because he had a few other things to say. What else did he say? He said, one day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Here, like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, reading the Constitution through the Declaration of Independence. And he also said, an unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. And it's a law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. So King did not violate the duty of civility, as I described it, by making the Thomistic statement about unjust laws being no laws at all, therefore there being reasons for disobeying them, because he had these other things to say as well. That's the duty of civility. What are the benefits of civility? There are three reasons for supporting a duty of civility, which I will call, respectively, reasons of equality, humility, and political inclusion. Equality, one case for acting on the duty, embracing and acting on the duty of civility is that by doing so, you treat other citizens as equals. You reject the idea that politics is a kind of private property owned by you and the people you agree with. You treat others as equal members of we the people by constructing political justifications that respect the duty of civility. You also show a kind of humility. I think I'm right, but I acknowledge that I might be wrong. You acknowledge that reasonable people might disagree with you and looking to work on common ground, and you look to work on common ground that reasonable people can all accept. And third, arguing on common ground is inclusive. Think of movements against slavery, for religious toleration, for extending suffrage, against racial apartheid, against subordination of women, against class domination, and for universal human rights. All of these movements have been animated by an ideal of inclusion. All reject the idea that there's anyone who has the status of no count. By looking for common ground, you are being inclusive in the democratic community. This brings me to the third question. The third question is, what are some costs of civility? To which you might say, costs? Civility? Isn't civility all nice and warm and cozy? Somebody asked me, it's not my dog, but it is my design thinking. This is user-centered design. Isn't it all nice like that dog? You want to pet the dog and you want to pet civility. No, it isn't. The duty of civility, as I said earlier, requires a kind of self-restraint. So what are some of the costs of the self-restraint imposed by the duty of civility? Again, these are things that we've talked about earlier today. First of all, you may end up sacrificing justice because part of the duty of civility is a willingness to accommodate. And after all, when you accommodate, you're accommodating people who you think are wrong and views that you think are wrong. So there's a potential cost there. A second cost is that you may sacrifice truth by being willing to accommodate. What I mean here is not that you'll say something that you think is false, but that you will, as part of the self-restraint demanded by the duty of civility, not present everything that you think is true. Not because you think it isn't really true, it's true, but you think it's inappropriate in a political community of equals to offer that justification for law and policy that is intended to command the respect of all. So you might sacrifice justice, you might sacrifice some truth, and you may be played for a sucker. Played for a sucker by being civil to others who are not being civil, always with the danger that people are pretending to be civil, and if you can pretend to be civil and have other people believe you, then you've really got things cracked. So you may be played for a sucker by being civil to others who are not being civil in return. Here's an example of this. This comes from freerepublic.com. It says, the left has perfected the gentle art of character assassination while complaining about the politics of personal destruction. Their idea of a civilized dialogue is calling us really mean Nazis while our mouths are taped shut. And it says on that tape, civility. I'm adding that point. So there may well be costs to civility, to respecting the duty of civility. And that brings me to question 4, which is, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And if so, when, under what circumstances? What's the right balance? It's a tricky balancing act. And I leave that discussion of that issue for the treatment of that issue for discussion. Thank you.
One of the nice things about philosophers, of course, is they always disagree with each other. And our next speaker, Brian Leiter, is also going to say what civility is, but it's pretty much the opposite, I think, of what we've just heard. Brian Leiter is the John P. Wilson Professor of Law, and he's the director of the Center for Law, Philosophy, and Human Values at the University of Chicago. He has written extensively in the area of moral, political, and legal philosophy. Brian.
Thanks, Anne. It won't be quite the opposite, though it is going to be a bit different. So my question is, what are the circumstances in which civility in discourse is both necessary and obligatory? And by civility in discourse, I'm going to mean observing a variety of norms about language, tone, and attitude governing an exchange of words and ideas. So, for example, showing respect for the other person or persons with whom one is conversing, avoiding insulting, demeaning, or derisive language or gestures, and genuinely listening to what the other person says. So this is a bit more capacious than the Rawlsian duty of civility. I think it's a bit closer to what I'll just call the ordinary folk concept of civility that is illustrated by the example that introduces the program, right? Somebody interrupting the President of the United States during a speech to say, "You lie," right? I think that's uncivil in roughly the sense I'm talking about here. I also want to emphasize it's not incompatible with all aspects of the Rawlsian duty of civility, and it's also significantly less capacious than I think some of the other things that I've heard described today as cases of civility and uncivility. Right? So, for example, there are a lot of things to say about self-immolation as a form of political protest, but I actually don't think it has anything to do with civility or uncivility. But we can talk about that in discussion. So I'm going to assume pre-theoretically that everyone can agree that civility is paramount for discourse in the classroom setting. And I think even Tom Segru said something along that lines this morning. That is, teachers should be civil to students and students to their teachers. So let's start with that case and figure out why civility seems so obviously important in that context. So in the first instance, the teacher has an overriding pedagogical obligation, namely to help the students understand the material being taught. Understanding is impeded by uncivil language from the teacher towards the student. Insults, disparaging or derisive remarks, or expressions of contempt make their targets defensive, alienated, and angry. It's hard to see how such a response is conducive to learning and understanding. But why should students be civil to the teacher or to their fellow students? I put aside the obviously self-interested reasons for avoiding incivility, such as receiving a lower mark from the teacher. Surely the real reasons for civility of students towards teachers and fellow students derive again from the obligations of those who wish to acquire knowledge and understanding. Just as the teacher has an obligation deriving from his pedagogical duty to ensure that the student is both cognitively and affectively, emotionally, maximally able to understand and learn, so the students have such obligations to each other and the teacher. For without their commitment to civility, the ends of education will also not be realized. Of course, the pedagogical situation has another important feature, namely an inequality in knowledge and competence in the subject matter between teacher and students.
Which way does that go?
There's also inequality in knowledge and competence between speakers, and we'll let the audience figure out how that goes. This is why civility towards this is why civility towards students is so important. Since students recognize the inequality in competence and at the same time are almost certain to make mistakes, sometimes serious mistakes, in their comments and questions. Yet such mistakes and the appreciation of them as mistakes are often an important part of the reliable acquisition of knowledge and understanding, a point that's been emphasized by many writers in our philosophical tradition from Socrates to John Stuart Mill. But only in an educational atmosphere marked by civility will students likely take the risk of making mistakes, and only in such an atmosphere are they likely to be able to learn from these mistakes. If the mistakes and the inequality in competence that is their source are an occasion for mockery and demeaning comments, then again the pedagogical goals will likely be defeated. Notice then that in the classroom, the circumstances of civility, as I'm going to refer to them, include the aim of imparting knowledge and understanding, a recognized inequality of competence between teacher and learner, the need for learners to have the opportunity to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, and the interest learners have in acquiring knowledge and understanding. The circumstances of civility, in short, involve essentially what I will refer to as epistemic values and motives. That is, knowledge, understanding, learning, and the desire, the motive to acquire all of these. I suspect the recognized inequality in competence is actually not essential to the circumstances of civility more generally, though it is a feature of the classroom situation. In circumstances where epistemic values and motives govern, civility seems to me to be essential and should be considered obligatory. Well, what then of the realm of politics, which is our real concern today? Politics, at least in nominally democratic societies, does not have as its primary aim knowledge and understanding. The primary aims of politics are practical, for example, how to govern our collective life and how to allocate the benefits and burdens of communal existence. Knowledge and understanding, however, play an essential instrumental role in the ultimately practical decisions that we must take in politics, and thus much of political discourse, in fact, concerns what we know and what is true. Will, for example, government-run healthcare improve health outcomes for most people or not? Will it control medical costs or not? And so on. So in politics, as in the classroom, one of the ends is knowledge and understanding, at least the kind of knowledge and understanding necessary for our practical decisions. But are epistemic values paramount in the political arena as they are in the classroom? In politics, most obviously, there does not appear to be an acknowledged inequality of competence between teachers and learners in a democratic polity, even though there are clear inequalities of competence aplenty, though not necessarily between citizens and elected officials. Nor is it clear that there is necessarily an interest in learning from mistakes, or even a shared interest in knowledge and understanding. In the realm of politics, sometimes the non-epistemic interests, our self-interest, the non-epistemic interests that are affected by a practical decision dominate all the epistemic interests. So let's describe then a political situation in which the circumstances of civility, as I've characterized them, clearly do not obtain. I'm going to call this political situation dystopia. So in dystopia, let us assume that political leaders and citizens do not speak honestly, do not state their actual reasons or evidence, and are wholly motivated by non-epistemic considerations, such as personal gain or gain for their group, however that group is defined. Political leaders and their followers do not acknowledge mistakes, since they would be signs of weakness, and they regularly subordinate epistemic considerations to non-epistemic ones, believing to be true whatever is most useful to those non-epistemic interests, and smearing or dismissing anyone who brings to bear actual epistemic values. Unsurprisingly, in dystopia, those who are not interested in knowledge and understanding are very concerned with being treated with civility, because they've noticed that those who are treated with civility have a certain kind of moral and epistemic status in our community. And this is an important point about civility, and it's related to some of the costs that Josh was just talking about. We only treat civilly those who have some reasonable claim on informing our moral and epistemic decisions. Those recognized as craven villains, moral miscreants, or pathological liars have no or very little claim on civil treatment. We do not, I think, take it to be a failing in civility of this conference that, for example, it simply ignores, treats as beyond the pale, the Nazi view that civility is a Jewish device for controlling the world. Nor would it seem a culpable failing of civility in Weimar Germany in 1930 for Democrats and anti-fascists to vigorously condemn the Nazis, to shout them down and deride them as vicious bigots with a monstrous agenda. As the economists like to say, civility is a signaling device. If you are treated with civility, then you must be a person with status in the community such that your input into matters epistemic or practical counts. But in dystopia, the most strident demands from civility come from those who have no actual entitlement to moral or epistemic credibility. Now, it's enough to create a dystopia that only one significant political party has the characteristics described above. If all parties to political life are dystopic in the ways I've just described, then all parties will have a self-interest in civility as a cover for their actual objectives. But the hard and really frightening case of dystopia is one in which some parties to public life genuinely want to acquire knowledge and understanding in order to make good practical decisions about communal life, while some other party or parties are fully dystopic. We can expect, as noted, that the dystopic parties will demand civility, but the real question is whether the other parties have an obligation to be civil towards them, given that those parties, the dystopic ones, have so fully subordinated epistemic values and motives to non-epistemic and self-serving ends. That the conditions of civility do not obtain, as they do not in dystopia, means there's no obligation of civility in dystopia, but it does not necessarily mean that we ought to be uncivil. The question now, it seems to me, reduces to a purely instrumental one. Perhaps even in dystopia, civility is a more effective means for exposing the hypocrisy or ulterior agenda of one's political opponents. But that's a complicated question about political psychology and sociology. It might turn out that in dystopia, the best defense for those concerned with epistemic values, as well as the good and the right, is derisive remarks and insulting polemics. There is precious little empirical evidence, after all, that moral or political attitudes are strongly influenced by dispassionate and discursive reasoning. So it might be that in dystopia, civility is not only not obligatory, but not even advisable, given other important moral objectives, such as the discovery of the truth and the promotion of what is just. I cannot hope to settle that question here. I want only to suggest that in dystopia, there is no obligation of civility, and that its desirability depends on an answer to the psychological questions about its effects. Well, one final and obviously timely question remains. Is the United States today more like dystopia or more like a society in which the circumstances of civility obtain? Like Josh, I'm going to leave the really interesting question for the discussion period. Thank you.
Our last panelist, who will also tell us what civility is Tom Christiano. Tom is professor of philosophy and law at the University of Arizona, and he has written extensively in the areas of democratic theory, distributive justice, moral philosophy, and political philosophy. Tom.
Well, thanks for inviting me to present my thoughts about this. I just wanted to, when I was thinking about how to do this, I wasn't quite sure how to do it. What I decided to do was to focus in on somewhat of just a part of what we call civility or incivility. I mean, I can see that the term civility, I think, is kind of a fairly undisciplined term. So it applies to lots of different things. It can apply to impoliteness. It can apply to disorderliness. It can apply to, I think even today, earlier, it was a suggestion that even sometimes disagreement or expressing disagreement suggested a kind of incivility. And I don't think that there's anything illegitimate about these different uses. I think that is the way we use the term. So instead of giving a general definition of what incivility is, what I want to do is focus on what I take to be a kind of paradigm instance or type of instance of incivility and explore some of the features of that paradigmatic type case. So first of all, to understand what incivility is, I wanted to say I'm thinking primarily here of a kind of ethical virtue or an ethical norm. It's a norm that applies to individuals in their conduct and in their thinking. It doesn't apply to institutions primarily, or even it doesn't merely apply to outward behavior. So it's a kind of an ethical norm. I think it's an ethical norm that's actually important for democratic societies. And the basic, and what I want to focus on here is the negative side of civility, which I think is really the core that we've been talking about most of the time today, and I think really deserves some close discussion. The negative side is basically that one should avoid incivility, both in action and in thought. So the question is, what is the standard case of incivility that I have in mind? Well, what I have in mind for the standard kind of case is that incivility is a kind of an inappropriate and disruptive interference with another person's ability to communicate with other people and be taken seriously. Okay? So basically the thought is that the core idea that I'm trying to hone in on is the idea of one person disrupting and thereby interfering with someone else's attempt to communicate with another person on some matter. Now, there are two different, I think, broadly two different classes of examples of this. One is, of course, heckling, shouting people down, making sure that nobody can hear you. Or also presumably just pushing them off the stage and things like that. These are all time-honored methods of incivility. So there are sort of physical methods of either stopping the person from speaking or stopping other people from hearing them. But another, I think, very closely related kind of thing that interferes with communication is various kinds of speech that are, invective, that are insults, that are various forms of abuse, vilification, very intense mockery, and so on, where these are intended essentially to stop the hearers from taking the speaker seriously. So you call a person a liar, okay? The thought being that once people hear that this is a liar, you suddenly, the audience finds it more difficult to take that person seriously. You call that person corrupt or a villain of some sort, and the thought is that it becomes harder to take that person seriously. So the uptake in the case of communication is damaged by this kind of action. So I'm focusing in on incivility in this sense of interruption, disruptive interference with someone else's communication, either of a physical sort or of this sort where you try to stop people from taking the person seriously. Now, I want to say a couple of things about this notion of incivility and the corresponding idea of civility. One is I want to say something about the idea that it's a basic value in democratic politics to be civil in this sense, not, that is, to interfere disruptively in other people's conversation or in communication. It's a basic kind of value in democracy. Or rather, what it is it's connected to a basic value in democracy, which is the value of mutual respect. The idea being that when you're disruptively interfering with someone's communication, you are, as it were, exhibiting or displaying or expressing a lack of respect for the person who's speaking. The basic idea, furthermore, is that it's connected with democracy in the sense that in democracy, we don't just have institutions like one person, one vote, and political parties and representative institutions and so on. We also expect people to act in accordance with certain kinds of ethical norms, that they comport themselves in certain ways with regard to other people. Now, the thought is that in the case of democracy, the idea is that we display a kind of equal respect for others when we act in that respect civilly for others. Now, what I want to say here is that, I mean, this idea of respect is very difficult to characterize, so I'm not actually going to try to give an account of it right here. What I'm going to do is basically give a kind of a model, which is of a democratic picture, which is, well, people, gather around, they state what they think ought to be done, they give their arguments, they expect other people to listen until they're finished. The people who are giving the arguments and their proposals don't repeat themselves ad nauseum. They just say what they have to say, and then they go off and give other people their turn. And of course, others listen patiently, listen to the arguments, consider them, try to respond to the arguments, and try to, if they do have a response, a counter-argument, give an alternative proposal and their own arguments. This is kind of at least one dimension of democracy. Of course, we usually don't end up with agreement, so then we get into a process of compromise and negotiation where we do something very similar to this, although it's not all arguments. So that's kind of the model, and the idea is that the basic principle is in a democracy, at least for the ethical norm, is to give each person a fair hearing for their views. That's the ideal, and that's what I think makes sense of the ideal of civility. And even if many people who are promoting this ideal of civility don't actually honestly intend this, when they are promoting it, they are actually, this is the kind of ideal that they have in mind, I think, roughly. And this is why what they say is compelling, I think, to most of us democratic citizens, because we're worried that this kind of phenomenon may be on the outs. Now, I think that if we think about civility in this way, we can see that there is a kind of basic, simple intrinsic value to according equal respect to fellow citizens when they have something to say. As a kind of intrinsic value, we treat others as equals. We listen to them, and we treat them as rational beings. There's also, of course, an instrumental value that Brian spoke of, a kind of epistemic value, namely you learn something if you actually do hear people out. So you have both the learning and the, treating another person as an equal. And so there's a kind of an intrinsic value that's going on here, I think, as well as an instrumental value. And my sense is that in all cases of genuine incivility, there's always something lost in the case of incivility. It's not, it's something lost because there's this cutting off of respect for one's fellow citizens. Now, I want to say that at the same time as saying, and agreeing with many of the panelists, for example, this morning, which is that it may be, all things considered, the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to act uncivilly towards people. It may be that that's the right thing to do, because it may be that the issue, that the possibilities of severe injustice, either bringing it about or promoting it or maintaining it, are so great that you really have to try to stop people from speaking, even though in some sense there's something amiss, but you're doing. So in some sense, what I'm thinking is that the problem with incivility is there's a kind of a presumption against it, but it can be defeated and overcome by more serious concerns. Now, but there are a couple of things that I want to note about this idea of incivility, which I think is actually really interesting for our own society, but I think they're sort of philosophically interesting features of it. I think that incivility is a normatively loaded notion. whether you describe somebody as uncivil or not depends in certain respects on certain kinds of values that you hold, which is why somebody can describe another person as uncivil and that other person can think, no, that wasn't true of me. On the contrary, it was true of you. The fact we can get the interesting thing, one interesting thing about incivility is you can have debates about who's uncivil and who isn't uncivil. It's an interesting feature of it, I think. You can also have debates about when it's right or when it's wrong to be uncivil. So, for example, I mean, calling someone stupid or a liar or a fool in an ordinary discussion is a normal case of incivility. Okay? However, if the person is, in some sense, fairly uncontroversially lying, maybe you have the letter that they wrote saying, I'm going to lie here, and you read it to them, or if they are uncontroversially, acting stupidly, then in some respect, I think that presumption falls down, and the thought is, it's not uncivil to say, oh, no, you're lying. I've got the evidence right here. Or this is completely stupid. The evidence is here. Or you're completely corrupt. Here's the video of you taking money from the developer. Those aren't uncivil when there is serious and uncontroversial evidence, or relatively uncontroversial evidence, to back it up. Okay? Furthermore, of course, a person can think that they are being civil, but not be civil. And here's the really fundamental way, and I think this is a place where there's a lot of complication that comes in, which is when a person, asserts that someone else is a liar or being stupid, and they think that they're doing it on the basis of evidence, but in fact, what's going on is the process of inference that they use is just really hasty and very emotionally laden and doesn't actually, isn't likely to be true. So a person who, as it were, recklessly arrives at the judgment that someone else is being stupid or a liar and then says it, even though they might think that they're saying something true and with good evidence, are still being uncivil in this way. This shows how I think incivility is not merely a matter of outward behavior, it's also a matter of the kinds of attitudes that people have. So the very same behavior can be uncivil in one context and civil in the other context, depending on the mental states of the person who's giving that behavior. The other thing I want to note here is that this idea that I gave that it's not always wrong to be uncivil because of the seriousness of the injustice that might hang on incivility. I mean, you think that if this guy continues to speak, the consequences for the society are going to be disastrous, and so you have to interfere. That can be a genuine justification, I think, even though there is something amiss. But there's a genuine justification there. The problem there, of course, is that people are going to disagree quite strongly, and when you have a highly polarized society, you get a situation where different people think that what the other group is planning is highly destructive of the society. So you can have circumstances here where this idea of civility, which in some sense seems kind of uncontroversial and is a sort of basic democratic value, can be highly contested, and where there are going to be very strong disagreements as to whether something is civility or incivility, and two, whether it's justified or not. Okay, so there's another thing I wanted to mention here. I don't think it's the case that all speech that describes people as liars or stupid or corrupt or jerks or whatever is a case of incivility. Typically I don't know, I mean, I've had a lot of experience in activist groups or in various political movements and so on. And people get up and they give speeches and they say, this person is a lying, corrupt bastard and we ought to get rid of him and so on. And they just go on, and their hyperbole and excess and so on are just an important part of political organization and political activity. The key thing here, I think, for the question about incivility is is if people, when they hear this in their enclave, then go out and actually believe it to be literally true of these other people, when it's not totally true. I mean, I have my experience in Chicago in 1982. I was working with this progressive group, and we were supporting this African-American candidate, Harold Washington, who eventually was elected to be the first African-American mayor of Chicago. He was initially giving speeches, mostly to almost all African-American crowds, but I would be in them sometimes as well. And he would give these speeches, and he was a beautiful speaker, so and they'd rise in this crescendo, and there'd be this excitement, and people would be shouting, and everybody was, and it'd be funny too. And one of the speeches, he said, and all white people are crazy, and everybody just burst into applause, and they were happy, and it was great, and it was quite striking because that would be, in some sense, if you took it totally out of context, you'd think this is the paradigm case of trying to contribute to an uncivil atmosphere. But the fact of the matter was that Washington, he knew what he was doing. Everybody in the crowd knew what he was doing. It was a hyperbolic, excessive, and exciting presentation. They knew that this wasn't literally true. When they went out and they looked at me, they didn't say, he's crazy, that he should be put in an insane asylum. And then when he walked past me, which was just by accident, he said, I hope you didn't take that too seriously. The thing is that the fact is that you can have a lot of hyperbole, excess, excitement, insults, all kinds of things like this in politics, particularly in enclaves, but it's understood for what it is. And once you get out of it, then you say, okay, I'm going to treat these people as real people still. Now the last thing I want to say about, sorry, I'm probably going over, right? Yes. Oh, good. The last thing I want to say is I've described, the idea of incivility and so forth in terms of a kind of an ideal of democracy. But of course, we live in non-ideal circumstances most of the time. I mean, of course, it's not always non-ideal. I mean, this group that we have today, it's pretty ideal. People are listening, they're interested, they'll, respond and so on. And many of the contexts we are in, we have these discussions. But in highly non-ideal circumstances, things get much harder. And obviously the discussion this morning of the civil rights group, civil rights activities, might suggest a context in which incivility, because these people are being pushed out of the whole democratic system, where incivility is, as it were, necessary to, as it were, get them back in, necessary to bring about a greater justice over time, then a thought might be, well, in those highly non-ideal circumstances, it's justified and defensible in this case. And in some cases, it's not incivility. I mean, in some cases, if you have a speaker who refuses to acknowledge any other speakers, I hope I don't become this in a minute, but if he refuses to acknowledge any other speakers and he's just oppressing them and holding them down, if the others start barging in, saying, no, it's our turn, stop talking.
You don't have to worry about us.
We know you're a crazy white boy.
That's not a case of incivility any longer, because of course what's going on is they're rectifying a highly non-ideal circumstance where someone is not displaying mutual respect to them, and so then they rectify this by barging in. Anyways, with those remarks, I just wanted to give you some of my thoughts about this sort of narrowly defined characteristic that I'm describing as incivility, and we'll open it up to discussion. Thank you.
Of course, I can't actually see whether there's anyone out there who wants to ask a question because
I think the lights have
you're
to
in the
go
dark.
off.
But
Mr. Leiter, you talked about civility. Can you
wait for the microphone?
Three examples.
Illustration of three examples where civility was absolutely necessary, and I believe one of those was teachers to students, and the converse of that, I guess, was these students to teachers. when looking at it, if you look at it in a post-secondary educational situation, it's quite different than looking at it in a K-12 environment. So at what point, when we're talking about civility, on either side of that equation, the teacher-student, student-teacher, does incivility become a cognitive behavior? Because we're modeling a different kind of behavior in the early years, and where the teacher actually is the resident expert in the classroom, or whatever the situation might be. And so we're actually being imprinted with either a frustrated desire to be less than civil to one another because we're not given an opportunity to verbalize some of our own frustrations as students, for example. So when does that happen, and how do we overcome what that imprint might result in later in life, in adult life, when you see a person in a position of authority trying to promulgate an idea, and all your only response can be incivility? Does that make any sense?
Well, I could say no, but I won't. I think it makes some sense, but I may not be getting the full thrust of your question. See, I actually don't think the K-12 context is different than higher education. That is, both my parents were actually school teachers at the K-12 level, which is partly where I got this impression. I think the obligations of civility in the pedagogical situation apply at the lower levels just as they do at the higher levels. If anything, there's probably an argument that at the very highest levels, learning can withstand a little more persnippetyness, right, than it can at the lower levels. But the less students know, right, the more they have to learn. It seems to me the more important it is, it's an environment in which they are, as I say, cognitively and affectively receptive. And the problem with incivility, right, is that it throws up emotional barriers to actually hearing, understanding. It just, right, it changes the entire focus of the interaction. So I guess I would resist what I took to be the premise of your question, that in fact the K-12 context is a different one. I think it's certainly true that there can be circumstances, in a way related to something Tom was saying, where the presumption of civility, even in the pedagogical context, can be defeasible in certain kinds of extreme circumstances. But hopefully those are few and far between.
Professor Cohen also wants to add.
Prompted by the question.
Microphone.
You need to mic him.
Oh.
Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, thanks. So prompted by the question, I wanted to take a moment to pursue an issue that I think bears very much on our subject that Brian and I have discussed elsewhere, which is the idea of being in a conversational setting in which what you try to do is to make the best out of what other people say. So you described the requirements of civility in the educational setting as showing respect, avoiding insult, and listening. None of those quite rise to the level, if I can put it tendentiously that way, of making the best out of what students in the class are saying, you know, silk from sow's ears, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you think that there is, as an extension of the story that you tell about civility, and an extension of the story about how the norms of civility are essential to have an purely epistemic value. They serve the purposes of learning. Is there an extension from showing respect, avoiding insult, and listening to taking remarks that are often inchoate on a good day, and you know, making something better out of them, or is that a further requirement beyond the respect, avoiding insult, and listening?
No, it seems to me perfectly reasonable to incorporate that into the idea of what's necessary for achieving the pedagogical obligations, right? That is, I mean, so I said, right, you avoid insulting, demeaning, or derisive language. I think, but part of that means is that if people ask questions that don't make, you know, sense or reflect a basic mistake, you try to sort of bring it around, right, to something that's pedagogically constructive. So in that sense, the epistemic obligation of the teacher-student relationship ought to govern basically all the interchange between teachers and students. So I certainly didn't mean to rule that out, and probably you're right, it's an essential part of it.
And
We need a mic down here in the blue shirt. Thanks.
Thank you. My name's Dan Leipel. I'm director of the Human Rights Institute down the road in Coeur d'Alene, and I want to thank you for this wonderful day. I actually wasn't supposed to be here, but they don't pay me a lot, so I thought I'd get a free cup of coffee and some lunch. I had to sit here at least to listen to you. The question I guess you had asked the question, what's the cost? Right. And I mean, this has been going through all day. I'm trying, because we're every day working on trying to take this whole human rights to the street. But I think it was Professor Lagval I think I pronounced it right, hopefully, who said the civility back in the early 60s caused people not to speak up when we got into a Vietnam War. Had they been less civil at the time, I would not have had to been less civil several years later, nor would I have had to gotten a draft notice. So, I mean, that was like one issue that's just stuck in my craw. Yeah. The other thing, in terms of the civility or lack of civility, is right now you see politicians, I have this image of these two New York congressmen standing there yelling at each other. Who was it? King and Weiner, I think, whoever they were. Yeah. I'm from Philly. That's what New Yorkers do. So you can understand it.
It's obligatory, actually.
I don't think the rest of the country really understands that.
Philly competes with that, though.
Pardon?
Yeah. I said Philly competes with that.
No,
with the New Yorkers.
No, we do it.
Bullshit.
I didn't compete with the PhD. Some dumb MBA. What can I do for you? I guess the wind up, the cost with all this, on one, I didn't get it. I didn't go to Vietnam, thank God for my bad heart. But two, I think that one of the costs you see when you see congressmen yelling and all this, and people really not listening to other, that you have a populace that is just turned off, that everybody's bad, that nobody's good, that you've got a community, a population that doesn't, just doesn't believe anybody anymore. So I mean, if you ask the cost, and I don't know whether your reaction, but from where I sit, people say, a pox on both your houses, as my wife's grandmother used to say, "Feh." Thank you, and thanks for lunch.
My wife's grandmother talks more like Melissa Leo, so but I can't say that in public. So, like Brian, I thought that there was a kind of expansiveness in the stories about civility that were being told this morning. I agree with Brian that self-immolation, there are many things to be said about it. I'm quoting him, but that it's uncivil wouldn't be on my list of things to be said. Similarly, I think, so I want to make 2 points. One is, I think that if you run together, as I thought people were doing to some extent this morning, being civil with being subservient, then it's pretty easy to think that the costs of civility are too high. I don't think civility is subservience. The second point is, and I would like to see what the quotation from Wayne Morse was. Anyway, the second point is that I think there were three proposals. We took different slices, 3 ideas about civility that were advanced here. One is Tom's that you ought not to be communicatively disruptive, that incivility is being communicatively disruptive. Brian's that you show some kind of conversational respect, avoid insult, et cetera, because and when it helps to achieve a pretty well-defined purpose, at least in education, et cetera. And I had this really much narrower proposal about civility. What I said is that you ought to justify on common ground. Doing that is compatible with a huge amount of stuff that's been described over the course of the day as incivility. And I agree completely with the criticisms that have been made about recommendations of civility that, I mean, I agree with freerepublic.com that lots of arguments about being civil are arguments that say basically keep your mouth shut while we say whatever we want. I do think, though, that there's a fundamental political value to this trying to argue vigorously, aggressively, I hope aggressively. It's bad for me if you can't do that, but conducted on a common ground that can be shared by people in a pluralist democracy. But I think it's, I think these guys have more trouble because of their more expansive ideas about what civility is, being conversationally disruptive or not showing appropriate respect in these particular settings. I think they have more trouble with what look to be perfectly, acceptable good uses of incivility in the sense of, pushing back hard, more trouble than I do.
Do you guys want to jump in on that?
Well, so we should probably both say why, whether we have this trouble.
Yeah.
So let me say, I don't think either Tom or I actually accept the idea of the Rawlsian duty of civility, though Tom will speak for himself on this, because the worry is that it imposes a demand, namely to only rely in political argument on reasons that are generally acceptable to reasonable people, as Rawls always says, that I think there's reason to be skeptical there are any such reasons. And that the way the Rawlsians tend to dodge this is they denominate anybody who gives the wrong kind of reasons as unreasonable. So that's the skeptical view of the Rawlsian idea of the duty of civility. Now, I actually don't think I have a problem with the particular case Dan is that right, that Dan brought up? Because I don't think that civility, in my somewhat more capacious sense, but not as capacious as some others, is obligatory in situations that have the characteristics of dystopia. And I think some of the incidents you're talking about in the history of American political life were deeply dystopic moments, right? So when the President of the United States, LBJ, just told a bald-faced lie about the Gulf of Tonkin, right, which he knew to be a lie, and he just made it up, right, he should have been called out as a liar. Right? He should have been called out as a liar because he didn't have any interest in knowledge or understanding or giving people information that would help inform honest, practical decision-making about our communal life. He was trying to advance a very different set of interests. In circumstances like that, I think there are no obligations of civility. Right. So in that regard, I think my view is a little more severe.
Yeah, I mean, I would describe the case that you just described as one where you're not being uncivil by saying he's a liar if you've got a clear-cut case of lying. But I'm curious about the example that you were talking about, the two politicians shouting at each other. I mean, there are different things that could be happening there. One is they could just be not listening at all to each other. That may be, I think that's what you were trying to get at. They're just shouting each other down, essentially. That seems like, yeah, a paradigm case of a kind of incivility. Of course, the interesting thing is that if you ask each one of them what they think is going on, they might actually say that they're not being uncivil. And the reason why is because their opposite number is a person who's being a complete jerk. And so it's not uncivil to call a complete jerk a jerk. And so, I mean, this is part of I think this is part of the thing that I was trying to get at the idea that the notion of civility actually has some normative ideas in the background, which are such that people can disagree very strongly about it, and thus though it looks to the exterior like it's uncivil behavior, in fact, that these persons don't actually think that they're being uncivil. What's the moral to be learned from that? Well, one moral might be that the discourse of civility may not be the most important thing we should be talking about, because it might be that whatever disagreements you have in a political society are going to be translated into whether people are civil or uncivil to each other, and so it's not really helping all that much. I mean, I think we can hold it up as a kind of an ideal, but it may not be all that useful for criticizing people. And I think the example that Josh gave of the Free Republic just shows how people respond to these kinds of criticisms. It's like, no, I wasn't being uncivil. And then it's like, so where have you gotten by invoking the concept of civility? Now, I know that's a kind of a down note for a conference that's supposed to be entirely devoted to civility, but that may be a worry that's in this context.
Okay, we have several questions lined up. The first is the gentleman in the tan shirt there, and then we've got some there, someone there, and someone there. So just keep your hands up when you sense.
Thank you. It's the right end. Good. My name is Richard Randall. I teach philosophy at North Idaho College. 20 years of soldiering and nearly 20 years of teaching has told me something. Well, it implies to me that we really need to talk about a moral duty of incivility when all else fails. A few years ago, I called Senator Trent Lott a racist in my classroom. This ended up, from what others have told me, making the national news, and it also sent the local Republican senator to North Idaho College campus 3 days in a row to demand my firing. And being adjunct, I was kind of hanging out there. On the other hand, the president asked me to come in. I was not about to refuse, and said, are you right in this? I said, yes, I'm right in this. He says, can you prove it? I said, yes, I can prove it. He says, okay, I'll stand by you, but you need to know that there's a lot of pressure. But he stood by me. About a month later, he self-destructs at Strom Thurmond's birthday party, telling how his racist ideas way back when, well, all of us real Americans really understood he was right all the time. I think I'm glad this started with the example of Martin Luther King Jr. because that's where we've heard something about leadership. I taught today, so I didn't get to hear the other speakers. I wish I had. What I think is that there is no moral obligation as a classroom teacher to let a lot of bullshit just fly out there. And by that I mean it's quite possible to have students who will parrot the dominant right-wing lies that are out there. And I say to sit back before that without challenging those. And if left-wing, right-wing, it doesn't matter. But if we sit there and do nothing, we're simply enabling. We have a president who's done enough of that. Now, I'm speaking as a progressive and a liberal, so that may be inappropriate for me to say that here. But I tell you that we're not dealing with people who are just, country club. We want everything the status quo. We are losing. As classroom teachers, we are losing, and some of you know that better than I do. So thanks for listening.
Brian, do you want to take that first?
Well, let me say, I certainly don't mean that the pedagogical obligation requires the teacher to sit passively by and let the class devolve into nonsense of a political kind or any other kind. The question is how you handle that as a teacher. Now, if you, as a teacher, you have a student whose modus operandi is basically this topic, that is, they have no epistemic interest, they don't actually want knowledge and understanding, well, that's a kind of pathological situation and has to be dealt with in a different way. But if you have students who are, honestly underinformed or misinformed about issues, it seems to me there is an obligation to try to set them right, but to do so in a civil way. Because the civility, again, I think, is almost always, with occasional exceptions, essential for the pedagogical objective. So.
Did either of you two want to jump in on this? Okay, so we've got a gentleman down here in the blue jacket. We've got 4 people stacked up. Then we got Lisa McGurr. Then we got the guy down here in the green shirt. Yeah. And then there was, so 2 more. So we got 5 people stacked up now.
Okay. First for Joshua Cohen and then Brian Leiter, not to omit you, but it happens this way. You spoke of the Rawlsian approach quite extensively. I've just been reading Intellectual History of America since the 80s by Professor at Princeton, and this may seem a little in-groupy, but I think it has broader relevance, perhaps. In this Intellectual History of America, he argues that Rawls, while he had great influence for a time, his reputation has faded quite significantly, and the argument is the excessively abstract nature of his theory of justice and theory of civility, I guess, and the author contrasts it with Michael Walzer, who seems to embed these discussions in specific real situations, and argues that it is in debating real situations that we get a better handle on these questions of justice and civility. So if you could respond to that. And then could I throw back to you, Professor Leiter, what you threw at us at the beginning, and that is, if for purposes of discussion, we assume that in contemporary America we're something very close to what you described as dystopia, in which one side, and I'm not just relating this to political parties, but one group of public figures do seem to be trying to address serious public issues, and they do not have a partner, debating discussion partner on the other side. Every time we hear there's wisdom in both sides and we need to sit down and reason together, that's simply thrown back to those who are making that argument, and those who reject that for political purposes simply dismiss it. So if, for purposes of discussion, we are in fact in dystopia, what kind of obligation for civility does that place on those who are seriously trying to address the issues of the moment? Thank you.
So, two points of response. The first, a more inside baseball response to the relative prominence of Rawls and Michael Walzer in contemporary political philosophy, then a more serious engagement with the question. I mean, Tom and Brian can, what can I say? They can disagree if they want, at the cost of being wrong. I think it's fair to say that Rawls remains the starting point of work in political philosophy, and that Michael Walzer, Spheres of Justice was a wonderful book in many ways, but it's not. It doesn't have the stature. So, but that's the inside baseball response. The more serious point is about this concern about abstractness of political philosophy. So, you know, Lincoln said at Gettysburg that that this country was conceived in an idea and dedicated to a proposition. The idea of liberty and the proposition that we're all created equal. He didn't say that the country, I'm partly echoing what Michael Kazin said earlier today, it's not a country founded on a common language, a common culture, a common history, a common race. You know, it didn't emerge from tribes in the forest. No, it's founded on an idea and a proposition. So there's a kind of philosophical unity. And those are very abstract ideas and propositions. The idea of liberty and the proposition that we're all created equal. And much of the politics in the country, when it's best, is a contest about how to interpret, how to understand that founding conception and dedication. And the reason I think that the disagreements between people on the right and people who are more on the left in the United States are, the way I think about those disagreements is I do think that they are genuine, reasonable disagreements among people who have fundamentally different interpretations of those fundamental abstractions that are the common ground, I believe, are the common ground that holds the country together. Lincoln also said, rightly, at Gettysburg, that it was then, and it remains now, very much an open question whether this country or any other one with that kind of founding abstract conception and dedication can endure. And he was looking at the results of a conflict about its endurability. But if it endures, it's going to endure because there's going to be a persistent commitment to that founding conception and dedication. And it's abstract. And I think among contemporary political philosophers, the person who understood that Lincolnian idea best was Rawls, for whom Lincoln was a personal and political hero, partly because he thought that Lincoln gave the lie to Acton's dictum that power corrupts, because he thought that Lincoln wasn't corrupted. And Lincoln wasn't corrupted because in a very difficult circumstance, he remained faithful to that founding conception and dedication. That's an abstraction that we have to live with and we can't live without. We, if there is a we.
So I want to address your question a little bit in the abstract, because I don't think anything will be served by getting in. I didn't mean that as a joke, but I don't think I'm not going to be quite as abstract as Rawls. I'm not sure anything will be served by getting too much into the particulars of what different people think about the immediate political situation in the United States. So the question is, in a situation which has the characteristics of dystopia as I described it, right, what is it one should do? And as I say, I don't think at that point there is a strong obligation of civility. And I think civility becomes at that point an extremely minor issue. And indeed, I think it starts to become a distraction issue, right? And it has some of the pernicious aspects that were talked about in the history panel first thing this morning. I do think the questions then become largely strategic questions, right, about how do you operate in political life when at least one or more of the parties operative in political life are not interested in what's true, are not actually interested in knowledge, are strictly interested in the advancement of their interests of their group, right? There's now some very tricky strategic, and these are not abstract questions, they're complicated questions of political psychology and sociology, right? What works in those circumstances? So Weimar Germany in 1930 was devolving into those circumstances. And you know, there are probably people in the room better informed than I am to say what might or might not have worked in terms of turning the tide. I do think it would have been insane and offensive for there to have been a large discussion about, now, let's be fair to Adolf, right? He's got a point of view, right? He's got, you know, he thinks certain people are vermin, other people's are subhuman, right? No, I don't think that would have been the way to go. The question is what would have actually turned the political tide, whether it would have been adopting certain rhetorical strategies, whether it would have been political violence. Right? There are clearly circumstances in which political violence is morally justified, just as there are circumstances where civil disobedience is morally justified. Those are big, difficult questions, so I'm just sort of gesturing at them, and since you're a real historian, you probably can shed more light on this than I can in terms of what we can learn from the past.
Okay, Lisa.
I mean, actually, the gentleman did ask the question I wanted to ask, which is, and I'm going to ask it again because there are other panelists, and I would like to push you all in the direction of where you ended, which is the provocative question of, are we in this dystopic moment? And I think it is a really important question because, you know, it brings up the issue of why it is that we are having all of these discussions around civility. And it's an interesting puzzle to me. Is this an appropriate response to what is going on in the public sphere for one side of the political arena to be asking for understanding, to be asking for dialogue, and to be running up against the board of what you described, which is relative dystopic response on the other side? So I wanted to ask you, are we in a different moment now? Why? And what is the appropriate response more broadly to the panel? And then just say thank you so much, because all the comments have been terrific on the panel.
Thank you.
So let me ask you, let me put the question back to you, Lisa. What did you think when MoveOn.org called General Petraeus General Betray Us? MoveOn.org referred to General Petraeus in an ad as General Betray Us, and it was when he was about to give congressional testimony on the effects of the surge.
So I think that's being positive in terms of democratic discourse. Is that?
I'm putting the question back to you because I don't agree with your description of the circumstance that we're in. I don't agree with freerepublic.com that people are criticizing freerepublic.com and calling them mean Nazis and telling them to shut up and put tape over their mouths. But I think for a lot of people, people with whom you and I disagree, that calling General Petraeus General Betray Us was a betrayal of the value of civility. And so they don't think that we're sitting around being nice and friendly and civil and with our little dogs. They think that we're doing the very thing that we're accusing that we, okay? Okay, so just personally, I give money to MoveOn.org, but I publicly criticized MoveOn.org about the General Betray Us thing, which I thought was disgraceful. And I think the obligation to call out people on your own team is not an obligation that most of us live up to.
So, but are we in a different moment? Is this something new? Is there something that is particularly insidious now about our civil discourse?
Yeah. So you made the point earlier in your presentation, which I think is which was very important, about the overlap of polarization and partisanship. So this is more inside baseball, but there's a kind of minor industry in political science, one of the fields that I teach in, where political scientists try to figure out for people who are elected legislators what their best outcome is. For the inside baseball, this is called ideal point estimation. And they use these estimations of what's the legislator's best thing to predict people's votes. Well, now it turns out that for 90% of votes in Congress, all you need to know is party ID. And that is historically never been true before. So the overlay of partisanship, the predictability of positions on the basis of partisanship is, I think, something that's fundamentally new. And what it means is that there isn't any independence between the arena of partisan competition, which, as somebody said, is I win, you lose. I get elected, you don't get elected. So that is competitively structured. There are other aspects of politics that aren't competitively structured, like trying to figure out the best answer to a policy question. Those two things have become completely merged, and I think that is disastrous.
I agree. I think that's the fundamentally, what is distinctively new is precisely that linkage between partisan and party in the polarization, and that's what's changed.
Okay, we have 3 more people lined up and 10 more minutes, so can I ask both questioners and answers to be as brief as they can? Did you guys want to jump in on this one?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes? 5 minutes. Did you guys want to jump in on this one?
4 minutes and 40 seconds.
I mean, I've already spoken on this, so I'll pass.
So we have, is it Nick down here? Brian, yes.
So I wanted to sort of pick up on your comment about the 2 congressmen who were going at each other, and you sort of have started to address this, and it's this sort of notion of people in the political sphere who are being ever more bombastic with the pure intent of just getting media attention. I mean, I think the reason you know about it, is among all the other things that happened that day, is because they were so bombastic that they made the news. Okay? And how you sort of rein in that desire to be combative for the just spectacle of making attention versus then bring it to how do we solve the particular issue that they might have been debating.
Who wants to take that?
Tom.
So the question is how one reins in the a propensity to bombastic speech?
If your assumption is that that essentially creates a sort of dystopic scenario, how do you rein that back in a way that you can have a genuine desire to find a solution to a particular problem?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is I would distinguish the dystopia from this problem, because I thought that what Brian was talking about a dystopia was you have egoistic persons who are, they're not interested in good policy and so on. I'm not convinced that's what's going on here. My guess is that we've got, people who are actually quite morally motivated, but they're not treating each other very well. I mean, that seems to be what's going on. So I'm not convinced that it's the dystopia type phenomenon. How do you rein it in? Gosh, I mean, the trouble is I'd only reveal my Pollyannish character. I mean, I guess you rein it in by revealing, in some sense, by some event that reveals that they're not talking seriously, that they're being extremely, they're just not taking the issues seriously. I'm trying to think about what a particular case like that is at the moment. I suppose that, some people thought, I don't agree with this, that, the shooting in Tucson was an instance where you could rein in some of the speech. And I think it did have a little bit of that effect, although I'm not convinced that the thing was all that well connected with any of the so-called incivility. But, I suppose if you can tie some sort of serious harm or damage to the posturing of politicians in a certain way, then you might be able to help rein in, as long as, of course, it's reasonably uncontroversial for at least a large number of people that these people are either ignoring or causing this kind of serious damage. Again, that was what the shooting in Tucson was supposed to be. I don't think that. I think it's sort of. Obama sort of finessed it really nicely, and so somehow he sort of succeeded, but in a way. But that would be the best thing I think you can do. Again, the thought being something like, look, the main issue isn't civility. The main issue is you got to take these questions seriously. And if you're going to take these questions seriously, bombast is not the way to go. You're going to do damage to your own society in the long run. That seems to me like the way really to rein it in. But how more specifically to do that, I'm not quite sure.
There's a new social media issue here. So new social media serves as a bullhorn for bombast. And what has not emerged yet, I know it hasn't emerged yet, maybe it will, are a set of norms on the part of people who use new social media, norms of pushback against people who are, who are taking advantage of the bullhorns. And this is maybe equally Pollyanna-ish, but what you could hope for is that we're sufficiently early in the game, particularly the Twitter and Facebook game, that people who are upset about this, and there are some, I can give you a bunch of examples of this, that people who are upset about this kind of thing are going to start pushing back, and there are going to be calling out, bombast and other forms of, bullshit and whatever, things that are destructive, I agree with Tom, to political life. There's going to be pushback against them. That hasn't happened yet. Maybe there's just a lag. Maybe. That's hopeful.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to end without the last two questions because we have run out of time. But Brian, did you just want to jump in on the last question before we stop? Then I'd like you to join me in thanking our speakers.
Thanks, Anne.